In New York State, a felony conviction is forever. Long after they've completed their sentences, tens of thousands of New Yorkers continue to face challenges for life.
New York City has a number of new initiatives to help the growth of small businesses. While the city gives, it also takes away because of red tape and costly fines. So is the city friend or foe?
10 years after 9/11, higher education is taking a second look at the way it studies terrorism. In the past, terrorism was studied exclusively by political scientists. Today, it's no longer strictly an academic exercise. For many, it's a new career path.
Thousands of workers are lured to the U.S. each year in search of a better life, only to realize they've been victims of labor trafficking. These workers are living in a legal limbo. They can't stay in the U.S., and they can't return home. I'm Deborah Pangestu.
I'm Christina Diaz.
I'm Kalia Laney.
And I'm Bianca Seidman. We'll have those stories next on this month's edition of 219 West. Each year, New York State convicts almost 50,000 people on felony charges and releases about 7,500 back to the community. Over time, that adds up to tens of thousands of New Yorkers with felony records living in the state. For many of them, their burdens continue once they leave prison. No matter how much time they've served, they'll continue to struggle to meet their basic life needs because those felonies turn up on background checks and rap sheets forever.
When you walk out of prison into a new environment, you move slowly in a new environment. The littlest things that you wouldn't notice after being gone for so many years, it's technology bound against you.
Chris Carney also didn't know the problems he would face getting a job after serving 2 separate felony sentences in New York State.
So something as easy as pumping gas when you come home, I didn't know how to pump gas after almost 10 years incarcerated. I came back to New York City in the summer of 2008 after spending 9.5 years convicted. I was in the Painters Union back in the 90s. I went and reinstated my union book, got back into the Painters Union. I met with my union rep, and I was looking for work, and he looked at my address, which at the time was the castle next door. And he said, "Oh, I know that address." And that was the last time I'd ever sat down in my union hall and never got another call for work.
That address was a clear giveaway. It's a branch of the Fortune Society that provides housing and education to help people coming out of prison readjust to the community, what's referred to as re-entry. Eventually, he got a job there.
The opportunity arose to work for Fortune within their maintenance department. Within a year, I became superintendent of the castle, the place that I walked through the door as a shelter.
Carney's experience is not uncommon. Employers are reluctant to consider people with felony records for jobs, according to Joanne Page, president of the Fortune Society.
Many employers will not look at a person with a criminal justice conviction, even though that's illegal. New York State has better laws than most states. Essentially, you can't deny a person employment for a conviction unless the conviction is related to the job at hand. But there's a very big difference between practice and the law.
And from the day of release through their entire lives, they have to check yes on that little box. Do you have any felony convictions on job applications?
And what we see at Fortune routinely is that people are excluded from consideration for employment, even though the crimes they were convicted of have nothing to do with the job that they're seeking. It's a lifetime barrier, not a barrier just after release from incarceration.
New York State has one of the highest populations in the country of people who've been through the state prison system. That's mainly because of strict drug laws with high mandatory sentences that were begun in the 70s.
What we're seeing is the tail end of a period of mass incarceration in New York State. We led the way in terms of Rockefeller drug law sentencing, and now we're leading the way in bringing down our prison population. But the consequence of having locked up so many people is that very many people are coming home again.
Organizations that help formerly incarcerated people transition back to the community know the problems well. Frank Murphy helps people correct errors on their records and talk to employers about their histories.
The question is asked, do you have a criminal history? And when they put yes, they are either not even called back for that job. I have people with master's degrees that go for jobs, a second job at a ShopRite, that have never received a call back from ShopRite simply because they have a criminal history.
What is it exactly that an employer will see when they do a background check? How much of the criminal history are they supposed to see?
They can see all of your criminal convictions. Any criminal convictions that you have, a prospective employer can see. However, sometimes they see non-criminal convictions such as violations because they're not sealed. It can just be a simple mistake of the court.
The FBI does 6 million criminal background checks each year. The U.S. Attorney General's office says half of those are inaccurate or incomplete, and those extra line items can look like a long criminal history. How long do these violations and convictions stay on your background check?
They stay on your background check forever. In other words, New York State, with the exception of the new Rockefeller drug law repeal, doesn't seal, reduce, expunge criminal convictions ever.
For federal crimes, there's something called the Second Chance Act, which allows people to expunge certain nonviolent felonies from their records after 7 years if they do not commit new crimes. But New York is one of 27 states that do not allow expungements. Though there are some certificates for good behavior or single offenses, most of those convictions still turn up on background checks. Keeping family life together proves challenging for people with felony records because they often can't qualify for or afford stable housing. Almost 73% of women sentenced to prison in New York have children. Anissa Thompson Jameson served 2 felony terms in New York State prisons.
My thing was, how do I stay away from coming back in here? My mind was, gotta get a job. Gotta get a job, and I gotta get a place to stay. At the time, I was legally married to my daughter's father, but he was not in the picture. So I had really no home to go to. It was room after room after room after room after that, because I could never seem to get a job, to make enough money, to hold on to enough money to get an apartment. And then I took her with me for a little while. We lived in a room for a little while. We were back and forth to my mom's and from room to room and stuff like that, and trying to raise my daughter and struggling with my own issues. I felt like the less she knew about how hard my struggles was, the better off we both would be. So I never communicated to her about how hard it was for me to get clean and stay clean.
In New York State, there are more than 160,000 children with parents either in prison or out in the community under criminal justice supervision.
It's in the public interest to let people who want to hold a job, want to support their families, be able to come home and do that. The other side is that if somebody has committed a crime in the past and then continues in the pattern, you don't want to lose that information when you're thinking about appropriate disposition. So conditional expungement, I think, matches both of those priorities.
New York passed a law in 2009 where the courts can give special permission to allow only the criminal justice system to see certain felonies. That's conditional expungement or conditional sealing. But there are no precedents to know what the courts will approve and few people who have met the criteria, so it's hardly been used. For now, both Anissa Thompson Jameson and Chris Carney have found permanent jobs and broken the cycle of recidivism.
People commit crimes, yes. People go to prison, yes. They do their time, yes. What they need to do is not look at the background checks of a people, but look at it, but also look at the person. Give that person a fair chance.
And the personal cost of fighting a felony conviction is something that cannot be erased.
I didn't realize how much of a damaged person I was when I came home. I think I've shed many skins since I've been home, just opening up, being able to love again, being able to smile in the face of somebody when they're upset at you. I've changed a lot, and I see myself in 5 years continuing this process and distancing myself from the days of my incarceration, but yet it's something that I'm going to wake up with every day.
Even if the felonies can ever be removed from their records, they'll be trying to work through the experience the rest of their lives. Bianca Seidman for 219 West. We have with us Ann Jacobs, who has more than 40 years of experience dealing with criminal justice issues for prisoners and formerly incarcerated. Welcome, Ms. Jacobs.
Hi.
Hi. So I want to begin by talking about how big of an issue is this? How many people are coming back into the community with felony convictions?
It's a really substantial issue. Each year, almost 700,000 people are released from prison and come back to our communities. But when you think about year after year after year, that number is not known, but it's very, very large.
Okay. And that's throughout the United States, right?
That's right.
Okay. And in New York State, I know that we have, one of the higher rates of people coming home from prisons. Is that correct?
Well, we do have a significant number of people coming home, but it's in the tens of thousands as opposed to the hundreds of thousands. And in fact, there is good news in New York. After 30 years of increasing rates of incarceration, we actually have seen a fall off in the number of people who are in prison in New York. Okay. We're one of the states that leads the nation in this.
Why is that?
That's a subject of great debate. For one thing, crime rates are falling, but it also seems like the behavior of the criminal justice system has changed somewhat, and there is a bigger kind of use of alternatives to incarceration, drug courts, front-end alternatives to just locking people up, throwing away the key.
And, we talked a little bit before about employment. Specifically for that, what happens when an employer runs a background check?
Well, there's no such thing as a background check. A background check can mean many things. If you're talking about an employer who actually pays what it costs to do a government record check, that's one thing. But a lot of employers rely on what they call CRAs, or credit reporting agencies. And their policies for obtaining criminal record information are all over the map. I mean, they're not necessarily consulting with the official records. They may be Googling. They may end up with someone who has the same name but is actually a different person. So one of the major problems that we need to confront is that, in fact, when we're talking about background checks, we're talking about a lot of information that isn't accurate, may not even be about the person that we're talking about.
Why is expungement something that, we could consider on the state level, or that we maybe should consider?
Expungement is one strategy. There are others. There are problems with almost all of them. And the fact is that in the digital age, even if the official action, the official court action is to expunge a case, it's going to continue to exist in the ether. So in addition to a technical kind of way of addressing it like that, we also have to do some public education so that people understand that someone having a criminal record does not mean what we think it means. It doesn't mean that they are not a person that can do a job and be a good citizen and be someone that we would want to go to work with and have live next door.
Thank you so much, Ann Jacobs, for being on 219 West. We appreciate your time and thoughts.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
The City of New York offers an unprecedented amount of support and resources for business owners. Training programs, a business accelerator, and 9 business incubators, with more on the way. They are part of a major initiative to spur local economic growth. But is the city undercutting some of its own good intentions with exorbitant fines and overwhelming bureaucracy? Many local business people are asking, is the city government friend or foe? Tom Patilis may soon be making some small improvements to his family restaurant in the Bronx. The upgrades won't cost him a dime.
Community Board 7 offered a grant to the stores in the neighborhood of $2,000 to remodel your store, to get new equipment, and you submit the receipts, and they'll reimburse you the payments in full.
This grant is but one example of a major city effort to grow small, independently owned businesses. In 2011, the city provided $2 million in grants for employee training, 15 affordable workspaces and business incubators, and a loan guarantee program for businesses with fewer than 100 employees. It all sounds good, but there's a catch. Many small business owners and their supporters say potential growth resulting from the small business-friendly policy is being undercut by hefty fines, fees, and a bloated bureaucracy.
You need a fire department permit, a building department permit, who knows what other permits. And they could all schedule their appointments on different days of the month, the week. There could be a 2-week delay. And meanwhile, you're paying rent to the landlord, and you're not generating any revenue to cover that.
Joan Bartolomeo has counseled and trained countless business owners. She knows firsthand that permit fees can add up quickly, ranging anywhere from about $200 for liquid carbon dioxide for soda and up to $83,000 for a sidewalk cafe. Add that to a $200 penalty, say for missing an appointment, and a few health code violation fines, and a business can start to go under before it's even launched. Rob McKay with the Queens EDC also works directly with small business owners and has seen how easy it is to rack up fines when you don't know all the rules.
A lot of times they're city rules and that people don't know about or they're not aware of. I always hear about someone starts a restaurant and then someone from the Department of Health comes in and finds 17 things wrong with them, and the next thing you know, they're fined or they're closed for a day. And a lot of cases there people don't know.
Jonathan Bowles with the Center for an Urban Future says larger companies may be willing to pay expensive fines and deal with long, costly permitting processes because New York offers an unrivaled talent pool and consumer market. This may not be the case for small independent firms.
It makes no sense to me that the city has a policy of trying to help small businesses with one hand through the economic development agencies, but then with the other hand, kind of hitting them with all of these ticky-tack fines. And I think that we really need to make sure that that we try to reduce that and make small businesses feel welcome, because in this mobile society that we're in, a lot of businesses can go elsewhere.
And while Patilis says that he's never found the fines and fees to be a burden, he does admit that he's seeing fewer mom and pop shops on his block.
I think slowly, the mom and pop stores, the stores that really built these neighborhoods and stayed in these neighborhoods, even when times were tough, are really being lost. I can name a couple of stores in this neighborhood that have been taken over their stores by franchises. And it's a shame. I'd like to see more mom and pop stores come into the neighborhood.
According to the American Express Open Independent Retail Index, over the last 2 decades, independent bars and restaurants have lost 7 percentage points of the market share, while small retailers have lost 11 percentage points of their overall sales. Stephen Grillo from the Staten Island DDC says that cheap office space and grants are only part of the solution to preserving and growing small independent businesses.
New York City has managed to become a small business's worst enemy. The approval ratings for the mayor are as low as they can possibly be. There's a general distrust of city government, and it's because there's too many regulations for a small business to go through.
And the city isn't totally deaf to complaints about fines. In August of 2011, a year after the city started giving letter grades to restaurants, Mayor Bloomberg waived $3 million worth of fines for those earning an A grade. So in the final analysis, perhaps small business and city government are neither friend or foe. Maybe they're just frenemies. For 219 West, I'm Kalia Laney.
Homeland security in the classroom and the trafficking of workers to the U.S. Those stories coming up. The aftermath of 9/11 has brought the rise of dozens of homeland security programs in community colleges, universities, and graduate schools across the country. With the promise of jobs, thousands of students have flocked to these new programs. One of them is right here in New York City at John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
31 miles outside of New York City lies the town of Ramsey, New Jersey, where Sergeant Richard Falatigo has served on the police force since 1995.
I come from a police family. My dad and my uncle just recently retired. It's always something I wanted to do.
After the events of September 11th, the veteran officer chose to go back to school to obtain a master's degree in protection management at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. While at the program, he learned of a new concentration in terrorism studies.
I went on a particular night to just sit, to listen to their guest speaker, and I was hooked. Prior to September 11th, I don't know if I really would have been as interested in the terrorism studies aspect of it. Really didn't ring home to the Northeast or to New York, New Jersey, as it did after September 11th. And it really kind of solidified everything for me.
Dr. Charles Strozier is the founding director of the Center of Terrorism Studies at John Jay, which began in the fall of 2001.
The college, because of its unique relationship to 9/11, was interested in supporting a center to try to stay committed to understanding 9/11, but to understand the broader context of 9/11 and therefore of terrorism and what that meant in the world.
Since 2001, degree programs dedicated to homeland security and the study of terrorism have been established at universities nationwide, many of them hosting students who are trying to heal from the tragedy.
For at least the first 4 or 5 years, I always had 20–30% of my students were people who had been directly involved in 9/11 as first responders. They came to try to understand the problem as a way of their own healing.
As people have struggled to understand the mind of the terrorist, new students are arriving having already done the research. Dr. Shuki Cohen teaches psychology of terrorism at John Jay.
One of my biggest problems is that people have read too much about terrorism, so they come to my classes with preconceived notions that I first have to disabuse them of before I can give them any other alternative knowledge. Terrorism policy in general has to strike a very tough balance between our fear of the phenomenon and being level-headed about what exactly is the risk.
While the risk continues to be assessed, the interest in these programs continue to grow.
Terrorism is not a field. Terrorism is a problem in the world, and it requires many perspectives to try to understand in order to find creative ways to protect ourselves against it.
In 2011, the Department of Homeland Security spent nearly $700 million to help safeguard cities designated as high risk for terror threat. And Sergeant Villarego is now using what he's learned as a member of a rapid deployment team in Bergen County.
We do threat assessments. We'll do critical infrastructure, security. You know, we'll check the train stations on an as-needed basis, like if the security level goes up or if there's some type of alert that goes out. So I probably use more of my degree work and the information I obtain there when I'm assigned to the rapid deployment team.
For 219 West, Christina Diaz.
This month is National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. It's a time to think of the thousands of human trafficking victims who are in the United States. These victims include men, women, and even children, lured by the promise of high-paying jobs and favorable immigration status. But once they get here, people like Annabelle find that most of their promises were false or misleading. Unable or afraid to go home and in jeopardy of being deported, they are living in limbo. America. For many, it is a dream. For some, it's been a nightmare. Annabelle Sabayan came to the United States to earn a better living and to support her family. Instead, she unknowingly became a victim of labor trafficking.
Since I'm the eldest in my family, and my father is just a driver, and my mother is a housewife, you know, abroad, we're going to earn much better money.
Sabayan applied for work in the U.S. through San Villa Management, a recruitment agency licensed by the Philippine government. The agency promised her permanent residency sponsorship, as well as a competitive wage and a job as a waitress. But these promises came with a cost. She paid almost $5,000 in fees for training and placement.
This is San Villa Bar and Restaurant. Our trainees do their training here.
Soon after her arrival, Sabayan discovered the promises made to her in the Philippines were not being kept.
The contract mentioned I supposed to work in South Carolina as a waitress, but when I arrived in Florida, they sent me, like after 2 days, they sent me to a country club.
She remained 2 months in Florida before she was moved to South Carolina. When she arrived, she was paid less than the state's minimum wage of $7.25.
My salary and my paycheck, it's written there in a different rate. It's like $7.25. I don't know how they're doing it, but it's written there like $7.25 an hour. But still the total, I don't know what magic they're doing, but whenever I compute it, it's like lower than $6 I'm getting.
Margaret, who requested her real name not be used, has a similar story. She came to the U.S. in 2008 as a temporary seasonal worker, also through the San Villa recruitment agency.
I was petitioned to be a waitress in the Philippines. When I got here, there was no job waiting for me, and I ended up working in the office just for me to have a work.
Margaret worked as a secretary for Jose Villanueva, the agency's owner. While she was filing paperwork, Margaret noticed the company was withholding information on employee contracts.
Overtime 1178, no, he never paid me overtime.
And wasn't processing paperwork, like Sabayan's visa extension application. Sabayan discovered what that meant to her when, in January 2010, she went to visit her sister who works on a cruise ship. Immigration officials approached her at the port of Miami.
I gave my passport, my other license, international license, and then together with the I-797. And then after that, in front of my sister, they told me I can't be with her and they need to bring me to their office.
It turns out that Sabayan's visa had not been renewed, and she was in the U.S. illegally. Sabayan was arrested and taken to an immigration detention center. She looked to her agency's owner, Villanueva, for help.
When I arrived in the detention, the next day, we're trying to call him again, and he didn't answer his phone. Even the secretary, 2 weeks, no show, no help. I'm getting crazy because I'm inside the detention without help, knowing that what's happening, it's not my fault why I'm here.
When Villanueva finally arrived, instead of offering assistance, he blamed her for getting caught.
They told exactly to our face that we shouldn't be in that place in the first place. That it's not their fault because I'm the one who went in the port of Miami. And then I cannot get it. I mean, why should I be hiding if I'm legal?
He signed her release waiver, but would not pay the bail.
I cannot wait any much longer. It's been more than a month. And then we started calling our family back home. They started borrowing money again.
In 2010, the U.S. State Department removed the Philippines from the U.S. trafficking watch list, saying that the country has begun efforts to prosecute traffickers. But in that same year, 3 in 20 seasonal workers recruited in the Philippines became victims of human trafficking. Chandra Bhatnagar is an attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union. He says this isn't an uncommon practice.
Absolutely human trafficking. It's because of the coercion, that the fraud and the coercion that's involved, where it's the lie that's told, and then it's the threat that the employer has over the worker, knowing that the worker is powerless to resist that threat.
San Villa Management's website is still up and functioning. Their Miami offices appears to be closed.
The number you have reached is not in service.
Out on bail, Sabayan came to New York in March 2011. Here, she found a group of other Filipinos who also work for Villanueva. They call themselves the Florida 15 and survive by working as cooks and nannies. She also found an immigration lawyer willing to take on her case. Felix Vinluan has handled similar labor trafficking cases.
I've seen several groups for the past couple of years coming out to the open, complaining about the abuses, about the, let me say, the trafficking enterprise of these employers.
If Sabayan were to return home or get deported, she would not be able to work in the U.S. again.
The system itself is fundamentally flawed, and when I say the system, I mean the U.S. guest worker program, because there are a couple of aspects of it that make it so flawed. Number one, if a worker arrives in the United States and their visa is tied to the employer that brings them in, then even if that employer is oppressive, even if that employer violates their rights, their whole ability to remain in the country is tied to that employer.
A decision of her case is expected the last week of January 2012. Sabayan could be designated a trafficking victim and issued a temporary visa. Worst case, she could be deported. For 219 West, I'm Deborah Pangestu. That's it for this month's edition of 219 West from the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. We'll be back next month with more stories from the 5 boroughs. From all of us here, I'm Deborah Pangestu. Thank you for watching.